The only woman on death row is suing the state. Christa Pike says lethal injection violates her religious beliefs. Pike brutally murdered Colleen Slemmer in 1995. She lured her to a remote part of UT's campus. After beating and torturing Slemmer, Pike kept a piece of her skull as a souvenir. The suit says Tennessee's new lethal injection protocol violates the Constitution and her religious beliefs. Pike also claims she has a medical condition that, if injected with the lethal injection, it would cause a drowning sensation. She's scheduled to be executed September 30th. It would be the first time in Tennessee that Tennessee has put a woman to death. Developing tonight, a Knox County judge is denying a motion to reopen a gruesome case from a couple of decades ago.
Christa Pike murdered Colleen Slemmer in Knoxville in 1995. Pike's lawyer asked for the case to be reopened due to the age difference between Pike and the others involved, but a judge denied that. Pike is the only woman on death row in Tennessee right now and will be the first woman to be executed by the state in more than 200 years. Her execution date has not yet been set.
The groundskeeper almost walked past it. It was early morning, January the 13th, 1995, and frost was still clinging to the grass on the agricultural campus of the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. He was doing his usual rounds near an old, abandoned steam plant, tucked away where students rarely wandered, when something on the ground caught his eye. At first, he thought it was a dead animal, maybe a deer, struck and dragged off somewhere to die. He took a few steps closer. It wasn't a deer. It was a young woman, barely recognizable. Her body had been beaten so severely that even trained eyes struggled for a moment to process what they were looking at. Within minutes, the university grounds that had been quiet just seconds before were swarming with police cars, crime scene tape, and investigators trying to piece together a night that had ended in something almost too brutal to comprehend. Her name was Colleen Slemmer. She was 19 years old. Just hours earlier, she had been alive, walking out of her dormitory with 3 people she knew. 3 people she trusted enough to sign out with, late on a Thursday night, and follow into the dark. By morning, only 3 of them walked back through those dormitory doors. Colleen never made it home. What happened to her in those woods that night was so calculated, so disturbing, that would go on to shock courtrooms, investigators, and an entire community for decades to come. It would result in one of the youngest women in the modern history of the United States being sentenced to death. And more than 30 years later, the story still isn't over. Welcome to XTC Uncovered. Subscribe if you're new, and drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Now let's go back to the beginning, to a federal program called Job Corps, where a group of troubled young adults were given a second chance at building a future. Colleen was one of them. So was the young woman who would go on to kill her. Their names were about to become tied together forever. And what started as simple jealousy between 2 teenage girls competing for the same boy would spiral, over the course of a single night, into a level of violence that even seasoned homicide detectives would later call almost impossible to comprehend. Let's rewind and take you through exactly how it happened. To understand what happened to Colleen Slemmer, you have to understand the place she was living in during the final months of her life. The Job Corps Center sat on Dale Avenue in Knoxville, a residential program funded by the federal government, designed to give young people between the ages of 16 and 24 a shot at a stable future. For many of the teenagers there, it was supposed to be a turning point, a way out of poverty, out of unstable homes, out of whatever chaos had defined their lives up to that point. Colleen had come there hoping to build a future in computer training. She was known by people who cared about her as someone with a soft spot for helping others, particularly children with disabilities, something she had loved doing since she was a little girl herself. But Colleen wasn't the only new face at Job Corps that year. Also enrolled was an 18-year-old named Christa Gail Pike, originally from West Virginia, who had come to Knoxville hoping to train as a nursing assistant. It was there that Christa met a 17-year-old named Tatterall Shipp. The two quickly became a couple, and just as quickly, they discovered a shared fascination with the occult. They spoke of Satanism. They wore pentagram jewelry. Shipp would later admit he had been dabbling in it since he was only 10 years old, and told investigators that Christa was, in his words, pretty deep into it herself. Somewhere in the weeks that followed, Christa became convinced that a fellow Job Corps student had her eyes on her boyfriend. That student was Colleen Slemmer. There's no clear evidence that Colleen ever actually pursued Tatterall's ship, but perception, in this case, mattered more than fact. Christa became fixated on the idea that Colleen was trying to take him from her, and that fixation curdled into something far darker than jealousy. She began telling people around her exactly what she intended to do about it. One friend would later testify that Christa told her, plainly, that she was going to kill Colleen. By January of 1995, the plan had a shape. Christa recruited an 18-year-old friend from the program, Shadala Peterson, to help her lure Colleen somewhere isolated. On the evening of January the 12th, the pieces came together. Christa approached Colleen with an offer of peace. She suggested they put their tension behind them and invited her to join them for a walk to smoke marijuana together in the woods nearby. Colleen agreed. That night, the four of them, Colleen, Christa, Tatterall, and Shadala, signed out of the Job Corps dormitory together and set off on foot. They passed through the edge of campus, moved along the Cumberland Avenue strip, and continued walking toward a remote, wooded area near Tyson Park, close to the University of Tennessee's agricultural campus. It was dark, it was quiet, and it was far enough from anyone who might hear what was about to happen. As they walked deeper into the trees, Colleen had no reason to suspect anything beyond an awkward evening of smoothing things over between two girls who didn't like each other very much. She didn't know that Christa and Shadala were already carrying weapons with them. She didn't know that somewhere in the conversations happening around her over the past several days, her name had already come up in far darker terms than jealousy. By the time the group reached the clearing near the old steam plant, whatever chance Colleen had of walking back out of those woods was already slipping away. When the group reached the clearing near the old steam plant, the mood shifted almost instantly. What had started as a walk framed around making peace turned, within moments, into something else entirely. According to court testimony, Christa confronted Colleen directly, accusing her once again of pursuing Tatterall's ship. She demanded Colleen remove her shirt. Then the violence began. Christa struck her. Shadala Peterson struck her as well. As the confrontation escalated, Colleen, panicked and trying to defend herself, grabbed onto Christa, who responded by pushing and slapping her back. That was only the beginning. Christa produced a miniature meat cleaver and began cutting Colleen with it. According to her own later statement to police, the assault stretched on for what she described as 30 minutes to an hour. At some point, a box cutter was used as well, and Christa would later admit to slicing Colleen's throat multiple times. Investigators would find that Colleen fought back as long as she physically could. The autopsy, conducted by Knox County Medical Examiner Dr. Sandra Elkins, later revealed defensive wounds across Colleen's face, neck, back, and arms, along with bruising on her knees, evidence that she had tried to crawl away from her attackers even as the assault continued. At some point during the attack, in an act investigators would describe as tied to Christa and Tatterall's fascination with the occult, a pentagram was carved into Colleen's chest and forehead. Colleen did not stop trying to survive. Witnesses would later recount that as she lay on the ground, badly injured, she kept asking her attackers, through groans and broken words, who was doing this to her and why. Christa's response, according to her own confession, was to escalate further. She picked up a large chunk of asphalt from the ground and struck Colleen in the head with it. When the asphalt broke apart on impact, she picked up the smaller pieces and threw those at her as well. The medical examiner later determined that Colleen was alive for most of the assault and that the cause of death was ultimately blunt force trauma to the head. Once it was over, Christa and Tatterall dragged Colleen's body toward a nearby pile of dirt and debris, leaving her clothing scattered in the surrounding bushes. Before leaving the scene, Christa did something that would ultimately seal her fate in the eyes of investigators. She reached down and took a piece of Colleen's skull as what she would later call a souvenir. The group returned to the Job Corps campus that night as though nothing had happened. But Christa couldn't keep quiet about what she'd done. She went to a fellow student's room and told her directly that she had just killed Colleen Slemmer, showing her the piece of skull as proof, describing in detail how she'd cut Colleen's throat, beaten her, and thrown asphalt at her head. Word spread quickly through the small campus community. By the next afternoon, a Job Corps security supervisor named Hudson had gotten hold of Christa's jacket and turned it over to a Knoxville police officer. Inside the pocket was a piece of human skull. It didn't take investigators long after that. Lead Detective Randy York of the Knoxville Police Department connected the pieces within 36 hours of Colleen's body being discovered. On January the 14th, 1995, Christa Pike, Tatterall Shipp, and Shadala Peterson were taken into custody. Christa waived her right to remain silent and gave police a full account of what happened that night in the woods. The confession was chilling in its detail, but it was only the beginning of what the courts still needed to decide. By the time Christa Gail Pike walked into a Knoxville courtroom, the state of Tennessee had already made its intentions clear. This was not going to be treated as a moment of impulsive teenage rage. Prosecutor Steve Sword, the Deputy District Attorney General leading the case, argued that what happened to Colleen Slemmer was not a crime of passion, but one of calculated, sustained brutality. The defense tried a different approach, focusing much of their case on Christa's mental health and troubled upbringing, hoping it might spare her the harshest possible sentence. It didn't work. On March the 22nd, 1996, after only a few hours of deliberation, the jury found Christa guilty on both counts, first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. 8 days later, on March the 30th, she was sentenced to death by electrocution. She was 20 years old at the time of sentencing and just 18 at the time of the murder, making her one of the youngest women sentenced to death in the United States since the death penalty was reinstated in the 1970s. Tatterall Shipp faced trial separately. In January of 1997, a jury found him guilty of both first-degree murder and conspiracy. But when it came to sentencing, the jury could not unanimously agree that he deserved to spend the rest of his life behind bars without any chance of release. The judge sentenced him to life in prison with the possibility of parole and added a consecutive 25-year sentence for the conspiracy conviction, a decision that meant Shipp wouldn't even become eligible for parole until he was in his late 40s or early 50s. Shadala Peterson, who had acted as lookout that night and later cooperated with investigators, pleaded guilty to being an accessory after the fact. She received probation. For most cases, that would be the end of the story. It wasn't the end for Christa Pike. In August of 2001, while already on death row, Christa was involved in the attempted strangulation of a fellow inmate named Patricia Jones, using a shoestring in an attempt to choke her to death. Jones survived. In 2004, Christa was convicted of attempted first-degree murder for the attack and received an additional 25 years, on top of the death sentence she was already serving. Then, in 2012, prison officials uncovered an escape plot Christa had been developing with the help of a corrections officer, a plan that was stopped before it could ever be carried out. Over the following decades, Christa's legal team pursued appeal after appeal, arguing everything from ineffective counsel to undiagnosed brain damage and untreated mental illness that had never been presented to the original jury. Every appeal was ultimately denied. Today, more than 30 years after Colleen Slemmer's murder, the case is still not fully closed. Tennessee has now set an execution date for Christa Gail Pike, September the 30th, 2026. If it goes forward, she will become the first woman executed in the state of Tennessee in over 200 years. Tatterall Shipp's parole eligibility date has been listed as December the 8th, 2026, though he was denied parole at his first hearing back in October of 2025. And for Colleen Slemmer's mother, May Martinez, the case has never truly ended either. For years, she fought Tennessee authorities just to have her daughter's skull returned to her for a proper burial. To this day, she still does not have back the one piece Christa Pike took from her daughter that night in the woods, the one she carried around and showed off as a trophy. Whether Christa Pike's execution actually happens on September the 30th remains uncertain, given just how long her legal team has managed to delay past outcomes. But for now, the date stands. And when it arrives, we'll be here to cover exactly what happens next.